When I turned 18, I bought myself a journal. I bought it so that I could detail the last bit of my awful high school experience. I also used it to write pretty mediocre poetry whenever I was stressed, frustrated, angry, or depressed. It was a really interesting coping mechanism that helped me through some dark times. It got to the point where I started referring to it, my dear journal, as him. I know it sounds crazy, but I loved that thing. My friend started calling him my boyfriend, which I couldn't argue against, honestly. I spent almost every waking moment writing in him, confiding in him my deepest personal thoughts. He really was my best friend. But after a while, school started to overwhelm me, and I started to write in him way less. I felt bad, kinda like I was leaving him behind. Eventually, I didn't write in him anymore. He just became something that took up space in my book bag. He went from being my close and personal friend to just a journal. The absence of my journal did not go unnoticed after school started to come to an end. I started to slowly fall back into my old patterns of stress-fueled rage and smoking to get away from the world. Without my journal to help me cope, I had no real outlet to help deal with it all. Before the year closed, my depression had hit an all-time low, and I was only getting worse. I eventually had to focus just on school, and studying to get my mind off of it for the next few months. My entire life was dedicated to my academics. My friends had already basically forgotten that I existed. I stopped hanging out with them to focus on studying. As I descended more, the only thing I was able to think about was school and how every moment needed to be used to get better grades. Every so often, I would think about my journal, sitting alone in my book bag, waiting for me to write in him again. Eventually, I took him out of my book bag and just left him on my bed to keep him from distracting me. If anything, it made it worse now that he was always in clear view whenever I was home. A constant temptation to stop focusing on school. The more I looked over at him, the more he would remind me of a point in my life where I wasn't so completely and utterly taken over by my studies. I started to despise him for daring to remind me of my former carefree attitude. No matter how much I would ignore him, he still would seem to beg me to write. I needed to do something. It was infuriating to have him around while I was dealing with school. He was a constant reminder of a time when I was much more pleasant and not the ticking time bomb of stress I had become. One night I went to sleep after a long study session, when suddenly a quiet moan woke me from my sleep. I got up and searched my room for the sound. After a while of searching, I started to follow the moans. I eventually looked at the floor of my bedroom, and I noticed that my journal looked like it was breathing. Like he was breathing. I reached down to pick him up, and the moaning had ceased. I opened it and started to read all the pages. Memories of my entries came back so fast I was nearly sent spinning. As I continued to read, my nostalgia started to turn into rage as I read through my past accounts of a time where school wasn't taking over my entire life. The angrier I got, the rougher I started to handle the pages until I ripped out a page. I tore out another page, and then another page, and then another page. Page by page, I started to dismantle him. His groans turned into heavy breathing that echoed against my skull as I continued to rip out the pages. My hands and fingers were covered in deep paper cuts. My blood dripped onto the crumpled pieces of paper on the floor, staining the pages as I ripped and continued ripping. When I was done, my journal lay on the floor, and he wasn't breathing anymore. I collapsed to the floor, surrounded by the blood-covered pages. I looked at my hands to observe my paper cuts my palms and fingers were covered in. There was so much blood. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, and when I opened them, the scene changed. What was once just crumpled pieces of notebook paper was now splatters of blood on the floor surrounding me. I looked to where my notebook had fallen. There he was, his lifeless, cold, judging eyes staring right at me. As the full frame of the picture before me came to view, I took a sigh of relief. I wasn't going to let school stress me out anymore. YouTube doesn't like what I'm doing, but I get the feeling that you do. If it's true that you do, you can support the channel on my Patreon located in the description below. Thank you for tuning in. Good night.